When I received that notice demanding $2,500 for violating fence regulation from the HOA, I just laughed. But when HOA President Jessica Thompson stood in front of my 12-year-old daughter and said that the smell of cattle would decrease property values in the neighborhood, my smile vanished in an instant. I'm Luke Harrison, third generation born and raised on this land. And that day, she made a massive mistake. Here's how it all ends. What would you have done in my place? Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell me where you're tuning in from. I promise, this story is one you'll want to hear till the end. The whole mess started on a Tuesday morning in October when I was installing a new cedar fence around the 5 acres closest to our house. My daughter Emma had been begging me for months to get some goats, and after losing my wife Sarah 2 years ago in that car accident, I figured giving Emma something to care for might help us both heal. I could still picture Sarah walking these same hills with me on summer evenings, her hand in mine, as we watched the sunset paint the sky over the land my grandfather had worked with his own hands. Those memories made every acre more precious. Every fence posed a connection to something larger than myself. I was just finishing up the corner post when I heard the deliberate click of high heels on gravel behind me. I turned around to see a woman in her late 20s approaching with the measured stride of someone conducting an inspection. She was wearing a white t-shirt with a pink heart emblazoned across the front and a knee-length floral skirt that looked expensive. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled despite the Texas heat, and she wore enough jewelry to stock a small boutique. Her eyes swept over my property with calculating precision, lingering on details like she was taking mental notes for some future confrontation. "Excuse me," she called out, pulling a clipboard from her oversized designer purse. "I'm Jessica Thompson, president of the Pine Hill Ranch Estates Homeowners Association. I need to discuss this fence situation with you immediately." I set down my post-hole digger and walked over. "Ma'am, I'm Luke Harrison." I kept my voice level and respectful, the way my father taught me to address all neighbors, even the ones who showed up looking for trouble. Jessica flipped through papers on her clipboard with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Harrison, all properties that affect the visual appeal of our community must comply with HOA standards. This rustic fence design doesn't match our established aesthetic guidelines," she said. She said the word rustic like it was some kind of disease, her grip on the clipboard tightening, knuckles showing white. "Mrs. Thompson, this ranch has been in my family for 3 generations, and it was here long before your subdivision was even a dream." That's when I caught the first glimpse of what lay beneath Jessica's polished exterior. For just a moment, her confident mask slipped, revealing something that looked almost like fear before she composed herself again. "We'll see about that, Mr. Harrison. The HOA has certain rights and responsibilities to maintain property values for all residents." She scribbled something on her clipboard with unnecessary force. "I'll be in touch soon." As she turned to go, my daughter Emma came running around the corner of the house, heading toward the school bus stop. Jessica stopped dead when she saw Emma, and for a heartbeat, her entire demeanor changed. The calculating coldness melted away, replaced by something vulnerable and almost longing. She watched Emma with the expression of someone seeing something they desperately wanted but couldn't have, her hand unconsciously moving to her flat stomach. But then Emma got close enough to catch the scent of the livestock, and Jessica's face hardened again, like a door slamming shut. "Honey," Jessica said, addressing Emma directly while her voice took on false sweetness, "doesn't this smell bother you? The odor from these animals is going to make the whole neighborhood less pleasant to live in." Emma looked confused and hurt, glancing between Jessica and me like she wasn't sure what she'd done wrong. The innocent bewilderment on my daughter's face, combined with the calculated cruelty of Jessica's words, ignited something protective and dangerous in my chest. I stepped forward, placing myself between Jessica and Emma. "Mrs. Thompson, I think this conversation is over." My voice had dropped to that quiet tone that people who know me recognize as a final warning. Jessica took an involuntary step backward, clutching her clipboard like a shield. "This isn't finished, Mr. Harrison. Not by a long shot." She clicked back down the driveway, leaving Emma and me standing there in the dust. After Emma got on the school bus, I stood there looking at that new fence, thinking about what Jessica had said, but more importantly, thinking about the look on my daughter's face when a grown woman had tried to make her feel ashamed of our way of life. As I watched Jessica's white BMW disappear toward Pine Hill Ranch Estates, I had the distinct feeling that Mrs. Thompson had just chosen the wrong battle with the wrong man. 3 days later, I found an official violation notice taped to my front door. The $2,500 fine was bad enough, but the threat at the bottom really got my attention. Continued violations may result in property seizure proceedings. I read that line twice, then started laughing, despite the anger building in my chest. Either Jessica Thompson had no idea what she was talking about, or she was betting that I didn't know my rights. Jessica had clearly spent considerable time crafting this notice, and I could picture her sitting at her pristine dining room table, probably with legal websites open on her laptop, carefully selecting the most intimidating language she could find. The paper was expensive letterhead, and every word had been chosen to maximize fear and compliance. Her hands had probably trembled slightly as she signed her name at the bottom, not from nervousness, but from the adrenaline rush of someone who believes they're about to win a decisive victory. I spent that evening in my father's old office, going through the box of property documents he'd kept since I was a kid, birth certificates, marriage licenses, tax records. And there it was, the original deed to our 40 acres, signed and sealed in 1962. The ranch had stood its ground for half a century before Pine Hill ever existed, which meant the HOA had about as much control over my land as they did over the weather. I made sure to photocopy every document, then sat down to draft a reply that would leave absolutely no room for misunderstanding. By the next morning, I walked my letter over to Jessica's place, that oversized colonial-style mansion that looked more suited for a lifestyle magazine than a Texas backroad. Not a single blade of grass was out of place, and every hedge looked like it had been sculpted with a ruler. When Jessica opened the door, she had on yoga pants and another of those pricey brand-name tees, and somehow her hair was salon-perfect, despite it being barely 8 a.m. Clearly, she'd been up early, likely already stressing over what I might say back. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness that barely concealed her satisfaction. I handed her the envelope containing my response, along with copies of all the relevant property documents. "Mrs. Thompson, I thought you might want to review these before this situation goes any further. You'll find that my ranch is not subject to HOA jurisdiction, and any attempt to fine me or threaten property seizures is potentially actionable under state harassment statutes." Jessica barely glanced at the documents before handing them back with a dismissive gesture. The papers might as well have been blank for all the attention she paid them. "Mr. Harrison, I don't think you understand how things work around here," she said, her voice taking on a harder edge. "My husband Brian has connections throughout this county, and the HOA has certain rights that extend beyond simple property lines." The combination of smugness and desperation in her voice told me everything I needed to know about how she'd been handling other disputes. Within a week, Jessica's harassment campaign began in earnest. I started getting visits from county inspectors who looked increasingly uncomfortable as they realized they were being used as weapons in someone else's personal war. Environmental health, building inspectors, code enforcement officers, each found nothing wrong because there was nothing wrong to find, and each left shaking their head at the obvious waste of taxpayer resources. I started documenting every visit, every complaint, every interaction. The breaking point came when I got home from work to find Emma crying in the kitchen. "Dad, Mrs. Thompson called the school today," she said through tears. She told them I might be living in unsanitary conditions because of the animals, and they had to ask me all these questions about our house and whether I felt safe here. My 12-year-old daughter shouldn't have to deal with adult political games. But Jessica had deliberately dragged her into this mess, using a child as a weapon in her war against our family. That evening, I called my neighbor Helen McCarthy, who had lived next to our ranch for 20 years. What she told me confirmed my worst suspicions. "Luke, Jessica has been going door to door with a petition, trying to get people to sign complaints against you," Helen said in a whisper. "She's telling folks that your cattle are going to bring down everyone's property values. Most people aren't buying it, but she's gotten a few signatures from newer residents who don't know any better. Between you and me, half the HOA board thinks she's gone too far, but they're scared to cross her. The next morning brought another escalation. I found a notice from the county planning office informing me that a petition had been filed to rezone my property from agricultural to residential only. The hearing was scheduled for the following month, and if it passed, I wouldn't just lose the right to farm my own land. I'd lose the agricultural tax exemption that made it financially possible to keep 40 acres. That's when I realized this wasn't just about a fence or property values. Jessica and her husband were trying to force me out entirely, probably so Brian's development company could snap up the land at a distressed price. I sat in my truck for a long time that morning, looking out over the pasture where 3 generations of my family had worked this land. The anger that had been building since Jessica first showed up at my fence post finally crystallized into something harder and more dangerous: determination. If Jessica Thompson thought she could destroy my family's legacy with legal tricks and bureaucratic manipulation, she was about to learn exactly what happened when you backed a Harrison into a corner and threatened everything he held dear. The county planning office was buzzing with activity. While I walked in that Monday morning, armed with a briefcase full of documents and a determination that had been building for weeks, I'd taken the day off from my landscape design business to research exactly what Jessica and her husband were trying to pull. What I found made my blood boil, but it also gave me hope. They weren't the first developers to try this trick, which meant there were legal precedents I could use to fight back. Pete Rodriguez, the county commissioner handling zoning issues, looked uncomfortable when I sat down across from his desk. Pete had known my family for years, and I could tell he didn't like being caught in the middle of this mess. "Luke, I have to tell you, the petition to rezone your property has some heavyweight backing. Brian Thompson's development company has submitted a comprehensive plan for the entire area, and they're claiming it's in the public interest." He slid a folder across the desk, and I felt my jaw clench as I flipped through the pages. The development plan was slick and professional, complete with artist renderings of luxury homes and manicured parks. But buried in the fine print was the real story. Brian's company had already purchased options on 3 other properties surrounding my ranch, contingent on the rezoning approval. If they got my land classified as residential only, I'd be forced to sell because I couldn't afford to keep 40 acres without the agricultural tax exemption. It was a classic squeeze play, and they'd probably used it before. "Pete, let me ask you something," I said, closing the folder and looking him straight in the eye. "How many other family farms has Thompson Development acquired using this exact same strategy?" Pete's face told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. "Luke, I can't discuss ongoing investigations, but let's just say you're not the first person to raise concerns about their business practices." That was all the confirmation I needed. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing for the public hearing like my life depended on it, because in many ways, it did. I dug up historical documents dating back to the 1940s showing continuous agricultural use of the land. I researched property law and zoning regulations until I could quote chapter and verse. Most importantly, I reached out to other ranchers and farmers in the county who'd been through similar battles. What I learned was that bullies like the Thompsons usually back down when faced with organized resistance. The hearing was held in the county courthouse on a Thursday evening, and Jessica arrived with an entourage that looked like they were headed to a corporate board meeting rather than a public forum. The response: she jumped to her feet, her face flushed with anger. "That's completely false. We're trying to create a beautiful, cohesive community that benefits everyone." But her voice had risen to nearly a shout, and several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Harrison is being selfish and stubborn, refusing to adapt to changing times." The county commissioners looked at each other, then back at the crowd. Commissioner Sarah Walsh spoke first. "Given the complexity of this issue and the conflicting information presented tonight, we're going to postpone our decision for 30 days to allow for additional review." It wasn't the victory I'd hoped for, but it wasn't a defeat either. As people filed out of the courthouse, I noticed several Pine Hill residents approaching me with apologetic expressions. "Mr. Harrison," said an older man I recognized from the neighborhood, I signed that petition because Jessica told us you were planning to expand into commercial farming. I had no idea this was about forcing you to sell your family land. 3 other residents nodded in agreement, and I realized that Jessica's support was starting to crumble. People don't like being lied to, even when the lies sound reasonable at first. As I packed up my documents, I caught sight of Jessica standing alone by her car, crying. Brian was already driving away, apparently having left her to clean up the mess by herself. For just a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered my daughter's tears and the fear in her voice when she asked if we were going to lose our home. Some lines, once crossed, can't be uncrossed. That night, I sat in my father's old office until nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, surrounded by law books I'd borrowed from the county library and legal documents spread across every available surface. Emma had gone to bed hours earlier, but sleep was the last thing on my mind. I'd spent years designing landscapes and understanding how land use regulations worked. But this was different. This was war, and I needed to find a weapon that would end the fight once and for all. The breakthrough came when I was digging through a box of old survey maps and mineral rights documents that my grandfather had filed away decades ago. Buried at the bottom was a faded piece of paper dated 1943, establishing livestock easement rights through what was now the Pine Hill Ranch Estates development. In simple terms, it meant that cattle had the legal right to pass through that area, regardless of what had been built there since. The easement had never been challenged or revoked, which meant it was still valid. I leaned back in my chair and started laughing, probably loud enough to wake Emma if she wasn't such a sound sleeper. Jessica Thompson and her husband had no idea what they'd gotten themselves into. They want to play legal hardball with a man whose family had been working this land since before their subdivision was even a gleam in some developer's eye. Well, they were about to learn that sometimes the old ways are the best ways. The next morning, I called Jake Martinez, an agricultural lawyer who specialized in land use issues. Jake had helped several ranchers in the county fight off similar development pressures, and his reputation for creative legal solutions was legendary. When I explained the situation and showed him the easement document, his grin was almost as wide as mine. "Luke, this is exactly what we need. If we can demonstrate continuous agricultural use and establish the historical precedent, we can not only protect your ranch, but potentially expand the agricultural zoning to include the easement area." While Jake worked on the legal strategy, I started reaching out to other ranchers in the county. The agricultural community in Texas is tight-knit, and word travels fast when one of their own is under attack. Within a week, I had commitments from 5 different ranchers to loan me cattle for what we started calling the Educational Grazing Project. The plan was simple: demonstrate that the land had always been used for livestock passage and that modern development shouldn't supersede historical agricultural rights. Emma was excited about the prospect of having more cattle on the property, but she was also worried about the ongoing conflict with the HOA. "Dad, what if Mrs. Thompson gets really mad when the cows show up?" she asked one evening while we were feeding her goats. I knelt down beside her, watching the goats nuzzle her hands in search of treats. Sometimes adults make bad choices when they're scared or angry. But that doesn't mean we should stop doing what's right." She nodded solemnly, then brightened up. "Can I help take care of the cattle when they get here?" The cattle arrived on a Tuesday morning in early November. 30 head of mixed-breed cows and steers that looked perfectly at home grazing in the pasture adjacent to Pine Hill Ranch Estates. I made sure they stayed well within the property boundaries, but the sight of livestock so close to the manicured lawns and designer mailboxes was clearly visible from the subdivision. I set up a folding chair near the fence line and waited for Jessica's reaction. I didn't have to wait long. Within 2 hours, I could see her white BMW racing down the development's main street, and 10 minutes later, she was marching across my property like she owned it. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, gesturing wildly at the cattle. "You can't just bring a herd of cows here without permits and environmental impact studies." Her white t-shirt was already showing sweat stains despite the cool morning air, and her perfectly styled hair was starting to come undone. "Mrs. Thompson, these cattle are grazing on my property as part of a legitimate agricultural operation," I replied calmly, not bothering to get up from my chair. All permits and health inspections are current and up to date. What I didn't mention was that the cattle were also strategically positioned to make use of the historical easement rights, should the need arise. If you have concerns about lawful agricultural activities, I suggest you contact the County Agricultural Extension Office. Jessica's face was turning an interesting shade of red that clashed with her outfit. This is harassment. You're doing this just to spite me and the Homeowners Association. She pulled out her phone and started dialing furiously. I'm calling the sheriff right now. I nodded agreeably and went back to watching the cattle graze. Sheriff Tom Bradley had known my family for 20 years, and he understood the difference between legal agricultural activities and an actual problem. 20 minutes later, Sheriff Bradley's patrol car pulled up to the fence line, and Tom got out with the weary expression of a man who'd been dealing with HOA disputes for far too long. Morning, Luke. Jessica, what seems to be the problem here? Jessica immediately launched into a tirade about livestock invasions and property rights violations, while I simply handed Tom the agricultural permits and easement documentation that Jake had prepared. Tom spent several minutes reading through the documents, occasionally glancing up at the cattle and then back at Jessica's increasingly frantic gestures. Finally, he folded the papers and handed them back to me. Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Harrison is conducting legitimate agricultural activities on his own property. Unless these animals actually enter the subdivision or cause property damage, there's nothing illegal happening here. Jessica's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. After Tom left and Jessica retreated to her house, I sat back in my folding chair and watched the cattle settling into their new temporary home. Phase 1 of the counterattack was complete, but this was just the beginning. I had 30 days before the zoning hearing, and I intended to use every single one of them to demonstrate exactly what historical agricultural rights meant in practice. The reaction from Pine Hill Ranch Estates was immediate and predictable. By noon, I'd counted at least 15 cars slowing down to gawk at the cattle, and several residents had actually parked along the road to take pictures. Most seemed curious rather than hostile, especially the kids, who were fascinated by the sight of real live cows practically in their backyard. Emma was in heaven, having appointed herself the official tour guide for any children brave enough to approach the fence. But Jessica Thompson was not amused. I watched from my kitchen window as she stormed from house to house, clipboard in hand, clearly trying to drum up support for some kind of emergency action. Her white BMW made at least 6 trips up and down the main street that afternoon, and each time she passed my property, she'd slow down and glare at the cattle like they were personally insulting her. The first official response came in the form of an emergency HOA meeting notice, hand-delivered to every address in Pine Hill Ranch Estates that evening. Urgent. Livestock invasion threatens. Property values was printed in bold letters across the top, followed by a list of supposed health and safety concerns that would have been laughable if they weren't so obviously desperate. The meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock the following evening, and all residents were strongly encouraged to attend. I decided to attend as well, not as a resident, but as an interested neighbor who wanted to understand the community's concerns. The meeting was held in Jessica's oversized garage, which had been converted into a makeshift conference room, complete with folding chairs and a projection screen. About 25 people showed up, which represented maybe half the households in the development. Jessica stood at the front of the room wearing a navy blue blazer over her usual designer t-shirt, trying to project authority and professionalism. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice tight with barely controlled stress. "As you all know, we're facing an unprecedented threat to our community's peace and property values." She clicked a remote, and the projection screen lit up with what appeared to be a PowerPoint presentation titled, "Agricultural Encroachment, a Clear and Present Danger." The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in fear-mongering and creative interpretation of facts. Jessica presented statistics about disease transmission from livestock, property value impacts of agricultural odors, and the supposed correlation between cattle operations and increased insect populations. She talked about noise pollution from bellowing animals and the potential for property damage from wandering herds. It was impressive in its thoroughness, and completely divorced from reality. When she finished her presentation, Jessica opened the floor for questions and comments. An elderly man in the front row raised his hand immediately. "Jessica, I drove by the Harrison place this morning, and those cattle look perfectly healthy and well-behaved. My grandkids were excited to see them. Are we sure this is really a problem?" Several other residents nodded in agreement, and I could see Jessica's confidence starting to crack. "Mr. Peterson, I understand your grandchildren might find the animals entertaining, but we have to think about the long-term implications," Jessica replied, her voice rising slightly. "Today it's 30 cows, but what happens when it's 100? What happens when we have commercial feed lots and slaughterhouses moving into the neighborhood?" The slippery slope argument was a classic, but it wasn't landing with her audience the way she'd hoped. A younger woman near the back raised her hand. "Has anyone actually talked to Mr. Harrison about his plans? I mean, has he said anything about expanding his operation or causing problems for the neighborhood?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and Jessica's face flushed red. "That's not the point, Karen. The point is that we can't allow agricultural activities to dictate the character of our residential community." That's when Helen McCarthy stood up. Helen was in her late 60s, a retired teacher who'd lived next to my ranch for 20 years, and she commanded respect in any room she entered. "Jessica, I've been Luke Harrison's neighbor since before this development was even built. His family has been nothing but respectful and responsible with their land use. This presentation makes it sound like he's running some kind of industrial farming operation, when the reality is that he's got a few dozen cattle grazing on pasture that's been used for livestock for over 60 years. The room erupted in whispered conversations, and I could see the tide turning against Jessica's fear campaign. She tried to regain control by calling for a formal vote on a resolution demanding that I remove the cattle immediately. But the motion failed by a vote of 12-8, with 5 abstentions. As people filed out of the garage, several residents approached me with apologetic expressions and offers of support. Walking back to my truck, I felt a mix of satisfaction and anticipation. Jessica had overplayed her hand, turning what could have been a legitimate community discussion into a transparent attempt at manipulation. But I knew this was far from over. If anything, her failure at the HOA meeting would make her more desperate, and desperate people make dangerous decisions. The next morning brought confirmation of my prediction. I found a notice from the county planning office informing me that my petition to extend agricultural zoning had been approved for public review. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks away, and I had until then to make my case for why historical agricultural rights should take precedence over modern residential development. Jessica had wanted a fight, and now she was going to get one on my terms. The county courthouse was packed on the night of the zoning hearing, with more people in attendance than I'd seen for any local government meeting in recent memory. Word had spread throughout the agricultural community about the precedent this case might set, and ranchers had driven in from 3 counties to show their support. On the other side of the aisle, Jessica sat with her hired legal team, but I noticed that Brian Thompson was conspicuously absent. Jessica had clearly spared no expense for this final showdown. Her lead attorney was a sharp-dressed woman from Dallas who specialized in land use law, and they'd brought a stack of binders thick enough to choke a horse. When it was their turn to present, the lawyers stood up and delivered a polished argument about modern zoning principles, public health concerns, and the need for orderly development in a rapidly growing community. "Commissioners, we're not here to attack Mr. Harrison or his family's historical connection to this land," the attorney said, her voice smooth and professional. "However, times have changed, and so have the needs of our community. Mixing intensive agricultural operations with residential neighborhoods creates conflicts that are simply unavoidable in the 21st century." She gestured to a series of charts and graphs that supposedly demonstrated the negative impacts of agricultural zoning on property values and quality of life. But then Jessica made the same mistake she'd made at the previous hearing. Instead of letting her lawyer handle the presentation, she insisted on speaking for herself. She stood up wearing another designer outfit, this one a navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment, and launched into an emotional appeal that quickly turned into something else entirely. Commissioners, I came to this community 3 years ago with a vision of creating something special, Jessica began, her voice trembling slightly. A place where families could raise their children in safety and beauty, where property values would be protected, and where everyone could take pride in their neighborhood. So far, so good, but I could see the cracks beginning to show in her composure. But Mr. Harrison refuses to be part of that vision, she continued, her voice rising. He's selfish and stubborn, clinging to outdated ways of life that have no place in a modern community. He's using his cattle as weapons, deliberately placing them where they'll cause maximum disruption to our peaceful neighborhood. The mask was slipping, and the real Jessica Thompson was starting to emerge. I've worked tirelessly to make Pine Hill Ranch Estates the kind of place people want to live, the kind of place that attracts successful families and maintains property values. But one stubborn rancher thinks his personal preferences are more important than the greater good of the entire community. By now, she was practically shouting, and several people in the audience were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up slowly and looked around the room at the faces of people I'd known most of my life. I didn't have a team of lawyers or a stack of expensive reports, but I had something more powerful, the truth. Commissioners, 3 generations of my family have worked this land, paid taxes on it, and contributed to this community. We've never been a problem for our neighbors, and we're not a problem now. I pulled out the historical documents that my grandfather had carefully preserved and my father had passed down to me. This ranch was established in 1942, decades before there was any residential development in the area. We've maintained continuous agricultural use, followed all regulations, and respected our neighbors' rights. What Mrs. Thompson is asking you to do is punish us for existing before her subdivision was built. Then I dropped the bombshell that Jake Martinez and I had been preparing for weeks. But there's something else the commissioners need to know about this case. Mrs. Thompson's husband operates a development company that has used identical tactics in 3 other locations to force family farms off their land at below-market prices. They file zoning challenges, create artificial conflicts, and then swoop in with purchase offers when the landowners can't afford to fight anymore. The room erupted in whispered conversations, and I could see Jessica's face turning white. Her attorney was frantically shuffling through papers, clearly caught off guard by this revelation. I continued. We've documented a pattern of harassment, frivolous complaints, and legal intimidation designed to force my family off land we've owned and worked for 60 years. This isn't about zoning or property values. It's about corporate greed and the systematic elimination of family farms. That's when Jessica completely lost her composure. She jumped to her feet, ignoring her attorney's attempts to restrain her. That's a lie. We're not trying to steal anyone's land. We just want to live in a decent neighborhood without having to smell cow manure every time we step outside. Her voice had risen to a near shriek, and tears of frustration were streaming down her face. I've put everything I have into making that community perfect, she continued, her words tumbling out faster than she could control them. I quit my job. I gave up my career. I dedicated my life to creating something beautiful. And you want to let one selfish man destroy it all because of some stupid piece of paper from the 1940s? The raw desperation in her voice was almost painful to hear, but it was also revealing in ways she probably didn't intend. Commissioner Sarah Walsh called for order and gave Jessica a moment to compose herself, but the damage was done. The mask had completely slipped away, revealing the fear, insecurity, and obsessive need for control that had been driving her crusade against my family. Several residents of Pine Hill Ranch Estates looked embarrassed. I noticed a few of them shaking their heads in disgust. When the commissioners voted, it wasn't even close. They approved my petition to extend agricultural zoning by a vote of 4-1, with Commissioner Rodriguez abstaining due to potential conflicts of interest. The historical easement rights were recognized and enforced, which meant that livestock would continue to have legal access to graze in the areas that had been used for that purpose for over 60 years. As people filed out of the courthouse, several Pine Hill residents approached me with apologies and offers of support. "Mr. Harrison, I had no idea Jessica was planning to force you out," said one woman whose children had been fascinated by the cattle. "We moved here because we want a peaceful neighborhood, not because we wanted to destroy family farms." Others nodded in agreement, and I realized that Jessica had lost not just the legal battle, but the support of her own community. The aftermath of the zoning hearing played out faster than I could have imagined. Within a week, Jessica Thompson was removed as president of the Pine Hill Ranch Estates Homeowners Association by an emergency vote of no confidence. The HOA board, embarrassed by her public meltdown and the negative publicity it had generated, elected Helen McCarthy as interim president and immediately began reaching out to me about establishing a more cooperative relationship. But Jessica's problems were just beginning. The pattern of harassment and intimidation that we documented during the zoning fight had attracted the attention of the state attorney general's office, which launched an investigation into Thompson Development's business practices. It turned out that Brian's company had used similar tactics in 4 other locations, systematically targeting family farms and small property owners who couldn't afford extended legal battles. Within a month, Brian Thompson was facing multiple lawsuits from landowners who had been pressured into selling their properties at below-market prices. His development company's reputation was in ruins, and several major investors pulled out of pending projects. The stress of the legal troubles, combined with Jessica's increasingly erratic behavior, proved to be too much for their marriage. Brian filed for divorce in December, citing irreconcilable differences and seeking to distance himself from his wife's actions. Jessica, meanwhile, had become something of a pariah in her own neighborhood. Most of the Pine Hill residents went out of their way to avoid her, and the few who remained supportive were primarily concerned about their own property values rather than any genuine friendship. She tried to maintain her perfect suburban lifestyle, but without Brian's income and with mounting legal bills, the facade began to crumble quickly. By spring, the for sale sign went up in front of the Thompson house, and Jessica moved out to a small apartment across town. I heard through Helen McCarthy that she'd found work at a garden center, trying to rebuild her life from scratch. Part of me felt sorry for her, but a larger part remembered the tears in my daughter's eyes when Jessica had tried to make her feel ashamed of our family's way of life. The real vindication came 6 months after the zoning hearing, when the county designated our ranch as a historical landmark. The recognition brought with it not only legal protection, but also a significant increase in property values, as the historical designation made the entire area more attractive to buyers who appreciated authentic Texas heritage. Emma was thrilled when the historical marker was installed near our front gate, commemorating 3 generations of the Harrison family's contribution to the community. But the sweetest revenge was yet to come. The agricultural zoning extension that I'd fought for turned out to have an unexpected benefit. It made the entire area eligible for agritourism activities. With Helen McCarthy's enthusiastic support, I started offering monthly cattle drives through the public easement areas, including portions of what had once been Jessica's perfect subdivision. The Heritage Ranch tours became wildly popular, attracting families from across the region who wanted their children to experience authentic ranch life. Emma appointed herself as the head tour guide, confidently explaining the history of cattle ranching in Texas while leading groups of wide-eyed city kids on horseback rides through the same pastures where my grandfather had worked decades earlier. The irony was not lost on anyone that Jessica's attempts to drive out agricultural activities had resulted in more cattle, more tourists, and more disruption to the suburban tranquility she'd tried so hard to preserve. But here's the thing that really surprised me. Property values in Pine Hill Ranch Estates actually increased because of the heritage designation and agritourism activities. Turns out, people are willing to pay extra to live next to authentic Texas history. One afternoon in late summer, I was fixing fence with Emma when I saw a familiar figure working in the garden center across the highway. Jessica Thompson was loading mulch bags for a customer, her designer clothes replaced by work clothes and a sun hat. She looked up and caught sight of me watching, and for a moment, our eyes met across the distance. She raised her hand in what might have been a wave or an acknowledgement, and I nodded back. Sometimes people have to lose everything before they can find out who they really are. Emma noticed the exchange and asked me about it later that evening while we were watching the sunset from our front porch. Dad, do you think Mrs. Thompson learned anything from what happened? I thought about that question for a long time before answering. I hope so, sweetheart. Everyone deserves a chance to make things right, but they have to want to change first. Emma nodded solemnly, then brightened up. Do you think she'll ever come to one of our ranch tours? I laughed and pulled her closer. Now, that would be something to see. The cattle in the pasture settled down for the night, their gentle lowing mixing with the sound of crickets and the distant hum of traffic from the highway. 3 generations of my family had sat on this same porch, watching the same sunset over the same land. And now Emma would carry that tradition forward. Jessica Thompson had tried to take that away from us, but instead, she'd helped us fight for it and make it stronger than ever. Sometimes the biggest battles aren't won with anger or revenge, but with patience, principle, and the courage to stand up for what's right. And every now and then, if fortune's on your side, the very people who try to tear down what matters most end up being the reason it survives for generations to come. From all of us at AS Stories, thank you for being here. Hit that like button, share your thoughts below, and don't forget to come back for more stories you won't believe actually happened.